Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Lore Cave. In today's episode, we're covering the history of the world of Emdod in probably the strangest way I could possibly do it, by covering the progenitor lineage that sparked from Garthog Thogg. So get ready to hear me sound like an idiot for an hour, because this time it's going to sound a little crazy, but I assure you, it's with good purpose. So sit back, grab the popcorn and hot cocoa, and let's discuss the history of Elinciae, and say some variation of Thogg 700 times. Enjoy. Join the Discord and subscribe for more. Hop in to insanity. Yippee! Garthog Thogg, the Universal Collapse Survivor, or the Progenitor. Born sometime pre-Universal Collapse, Garthog Thogg is known for leading humans as the initial non-dragon being, and is accredited with having created all the colored ways and all of their weapons. He lived a very long time for a Thogg. In fact, his lifespan is actually one that's considered to be very high in terms of just how it was, considering that when he first awoke on the Draken Isles, he was already in his mid-20s to early 30s, unbeknownst, because it was never determined what full age he was due to the Universal Collapse and all that. However, he did still live to see not only through the first century, but a little bit into the second century of Elinciae's history, of which is when the Great Exodus occurs. And after the Great Exodus occurs, he goes to Antaros, which is where he becomes a king and determines the burial grounds of the Tomb of Thogg, which is a very important location for all of the Thogg lineage. You see, the Tomb of Thogg is a magical, arcane engineering mastery that sits as a wonder of Elinciae's world. Garthog Thogg isn't the one who fully designs it, however, he sets the groundwork for it, and basically his son, Garthog the Mage, who we will now be talking about, would then go on and start designing the groundwork even further by making all the magical components used in the Tomb of Thogg, and would continue the leadership through Antaros and teach a multitude of magics to the world. During his time as king, he would actually make sure that the Tomb of Thogg would be able to indefinitely provide for the Thogg lineage and sit as a grand wonder that any Thogg at any point in time can access and, become be buried there properly, or furthermore, any wishing to observe the Thogg lineage and see some of its dead may come and visit in the anteroom of the tomb. This then leads on to Augar Thogg, the engineer, who would then further go on and actually build all of the pieces together and engineer all of the puzzle pieces that were laid through by Garth Thogg to furthermore, build the rest of the Tomb of Thogg. And his son, Rhaegar Thogg, would then further philosophize and think about what dragons are and classify them, and furthermore honor them throughout the Tomb of Thogg, building it into the stonework and having a multitude of people assist him with his philosophizing of what Wyveras are and how dragons came to be. His son, Bogarth Thogg, known as the Astronomer, would study Darvanis and the darkness of the sky, without telescopes, of course, because they had not been invented yet, but he would spend a lot of time looking into the sky, studying how Darvanus flew, and furthermore would learn to study a lot of what the empty expanse of the void surrounding Elinciae was. His son, Aligar Thogg, would be very bored of a lot of this, and actually decided to explore a little bit, and would adventure out into the world, and would forage and cook, as his title was the Adventurous Cook, a lot of weird things for the time frame. He was particularly resistant to poison, which also helps in this matter, but, you know, it was definitely something that added to a lot of the history books when he would eat something poisonous and then, of course, you know, be like, yeah, I'll just use this in my next dish, and immediately poisoning unintentionally off somebody. Oops. His son, Ragarth Thogg II, was a philosopher of the singularity. He philosophized how the universe came down to only being one planet, and was very confused as why there was nothing else. He never came up with anything that was solid as to a reason behind it. However, his philosophy stood as something that would shape a lot of groundwork for later philosophers of the Thogg lineage and of other philosophers at the time frame. His son would then be Sagarth Thogg, the Drunkard, and he was a bit better than his grandfather and became entirely immune to poison somehow. However, he ended up dying due to drinking way too much wine. His son, though, Gagarthrog Thogg, which was named during a drunken stunt by his father, was known as the Far Sailor, and in his time took a boat and sailed it all the way from the top of the world to the bottom, from Col North to Col South, as it is known in Elinciae. He didn't discover anything very interesting. In fact, he believed himself to have actually sailed in a circle whenever he found Col North and sailed to Col South. However, his discovery was then importantly discussed by mathematicians and geologists at the time, who would figure out the basic size of the world through his sailing. His daughter, Olga Thogg, the sommelier, would then classify a lot of wines, beers, and ales into a sort of rating system, which is still used in Elinciae today, also known as the Olga system. And as a sommelier, does have a lot of namesakes throughout history that would then be brought in to the modern day. Her son, Bolgarog Thogg, the Archsmith, created a ton of legendary weapons, which are collected and upkept throughout the world, being one of the first people who made a form of mithril to be used in weapons, which is now almost entirely turned to chronoton in the weapons it was used in. A lot of his legendary weapons have been lost to time in battles long seen. However, those who are keen historians who have found them are all accredited with having found basically a very large and important part of history. Thorngot Thogg, the Druid, which was the son of Bolgarog Thogg, ended up taking an arrow to the knee and would love his bees that he collected, and would end up basically just living a life in nature. His son, Logar Thogg, the mathematician, basically redefined how math worked at the time, and classified a lot of the engineering stuff that Ogar Thogg would use as a large form of introductory mathematics, which would then furthermore go in towards what our world would know as calculus, and Logar Thogg has been accursed by many a learning Elincian child, and thus making him one of the most infamous characters in all of the history of Emdod, due to the fact that everyone hates math. Garth Thogg II, the father of Arcana, basically took what Ogar and Garth Thogg did at the Tomb of Thogg, and further developed upon it, using his teachings from his father to basically classify what modern arcanists can do with mixtures of inks and paper, now being able to form spells, mixtures of different materials, incantations, and runes as well, helping furthermore amplify and create things that couldn't have been done at the time prior, and even furthermore would define a lot of ways to break a lot of normal physical systems with the magic system that existed. His son, Jargarth Thogg, the Potioneer, would spend a lot of the time with the knowledge of arcana that his father had, and made it into a form of potion mastery. It wasn't perfect because it wasn't exactly alchemy potions. However, it was a very good step in the medicinal direction for what could have been done. Jargarth, the second Thogg, however, would be known as the Poisoner, as when medicines are being created and are hard to control the substances, it's very easy to swap from healing a person to poisoning them. And unlike his father, he ended up causing a lot of problems. Logar Thogg II would be known as the Herbalist, much unlike his namesake Logar Thogg the Mathematician. He would effectively work with a lot of farming and would discover some of the healing properties of Renery. Not to the fullest extent of greater Renery or even healing potions that later alchemy would be able to perform via the usage of Renery, however was able to help preset some of the landlines for later medicinal herbs, and further would classify a lot of the medicinal herbs that existed in Elinciae at the time. Ragarth III Thogg, also known as the Philosopher of Magics, would philosophize why judgment magic exists, how it works, and generally figured out a lot of different unique nuances and special cases that would later on down the line actually help classify the difference between creation, soul, and judgment magic. He even discovered a little bit of their intrinsic properties in the world. However, because of the misunderstanding of how creation and soul magic worked at the time, he never fully wrote them into his greater philosophy, furthermore just collecting them as different forms of judgment magic, which was incorrect. Gogarth Thogg, the Rancher, was the first one to breed a legendary creature known as a Udiscote in captivity. The Udiscotes are very, very rare, commonly only being kept by those who are even able to be considered some of the highest animal handlers in the world, and he found himself one in the wild, raised it into captivity, and was able to actively breed one to get a offspring, which had never happened prior to this point. Udiscotes are now much rarer than they were even then, and furthermore, the Udiscote ale that is produced, not the milk, by the way, due to the fact that Udiscotes produce a type of alcohol instead of milk whenever they are post-child, thus making them a very well-wanted creature due to the fact that the ale that they produced is actually one of the highest alcohol contents without being too bad, and also one of the sweetest, kindest tasting alcohols in the world. Thogg, also known as the Fool, would entirely deviate from what his father had did because he was bored and didn't like any of the farming that his father, Gogarth Thogg, had did. So he figured out arithnomancy, a very particular type of judgment magic that is very harsh on the wielder if not used properly. He took Antros into a dictatorship for the time being, and made a few deals with a demon to help him better understand his arithnomancy. This, of course, would lead to his daughter, Balthog Thogg, also known as the Martyr, to be killed by Thogg as a part of the deal with the demon that Thogg made. His son, Thogg, which was actually the twin of Balthog Thogg, would be known as the hero who killed Thogg and avenged the martyr, and furthermore would help clear up a lot of the demon deals. He also was the one who basically took away the idea that the Thoggs needed to be the kingly lineage in Antros, and thus turned to a life of exploring after this time. Sagar Thogg, the son of Thogg, was a bard who basically partied and told a crap ton of stories of his father's victory over his grandfather's, and spun a lot of unique and interesting tales that became mythos to the world of Elinciae. His daughter, Ragatha Thogg, was known as the seamstress. She would eventually go and sew a crap ton of different dresses and shirts and a lot of special unique clothing, which actually became a business line much later on down the road, in a namesake to Ragatha Thogg's likeness. The clothes produced by this company are very well sought after and commonly considered to be of the upper classes' common clothing. Her son, Garlog Thogg, was known as the Desert Rover, and over his time would explore a majority of the Theonentian desert, and would actually establish a lot of oasis colonies in the Theonentian desert. His son, Korog Thogg, became known as the Miner due to the fact that he mined from the Theonentian desert to the Miskys Mountain, making the Grand Miskys Pass that is commonly used for trade routes into the Theonentian desert as of now. Balrog Thogg, the greater biologist, would be the first to ever discover greater bugs and other greater creatures. He also is claimed to have been the first to have actually seen a phoenix, but that was never exactly proven. And this was, of course, believed to be when he explored the Agatian Mountains. However, again, his sighting of a phoenix was never 100% certain. Garog Thogg, the Cold Hearth, would take the different traveling of his father and grandfather before him, and would become one of the main colonizers of Cassiitis, the cold, wintry tundra wetland that would be overrun by a ton of greater creatures during the early years of Elinciae. He not only became a great foe to many a greater bear, but he also tamed one, and then named it Grogthog, and then furthermore loved it more than his son. His son, by the way, was Gogarth Thogg II, also known as the Wyvern Kin. He decided he wanted to one-up his father in probably the greatest way possible. He domesticated a water wyvera, which the water wyvera he domesticated wasn't just a simple water wyvera. No. It was a Talion, which is a dragon shrimp leviathan, basically. He also, with his tamed Talion, discovered the Tirovius Islands, a small subset of islands further off the coast of Cassiitis. Grog Thogg II, named after the bear of Garog Thogg, would be known as the Greater Hunter. He would explore a little bit into Mashar, and would furthermore thoroughly hunt a lot of animals in Cassiitis, mainly greater bears. However, during his time hunting in the Mashari Desert, he was eaten by a Mashari sandworm. Malrog Thogg, which is known as the Hex, would then go on to make a precarious deal with a Neferjack to get his father's body back after years of needless searching for a random Mashari sandworm. And then, after he died, his son, Calrog Thogg, the Demon Slayer, would go off to eventually try to kill, but instead trap, the Neferjack in a set of ruins that would be abandoned in the Mashari Desert for a long period of time. Ithrog Thogg, known as the Desert Tamer, would then fully go in and explore, like his great-grandfather before him, all of the Mashari Desert, and would further identify a lot of different landmasses and oasis locations, and furthermore set up a lot of the groundwork for what would be towns in modern-day Elinciae. His son, Savog Thogg, the Southern Pirate, would go and then maraud a lot of these seas below the Mashari Desert, and basically lay claim to a lot of the trade pieces and thoroughly cause a lot of problems. His daughter, Sigog Thogg, was known as the Miskies Mountains Marauder, and would actually basically use her siren-like voice to allure a lot of different seafaring people and landfaring people going through the Miskies Pass to eventually, well, let's just say, steal quite a fair bit. Her son, Quagog Thogg, would be known as the Clown, who would end up going up to the Agatian Circus and be a part of it. One of the early members in the Agatian Circus, not one of the first clowns, but still one of the early, and would help grant a lot of the Agatian Circus's renown for its time. Malthog Thogg would then go up and draw a map, making him known as the Cartographer, as the son of Quagog Thogg, and would make a lot of those first initial early maps similar to what you would see in early history of Earth. Thagrog Thogg, his son, known as the Disputer, would then sail in a new direction and would find the Eblela Islands and disprove his father's maps. His son, Valog Thogg, would find Sarenvir, further disputing his grandfather's claim that this is how the world looked at the time, because guess what? It didn't. His son, Garug Thogg, would be known as the Tapestry Maker, and would weave a lot of important tapestries for a multitude of different royal families across the world. His son, Garug Thogg II, would be known as the Architect, and helped design a lot of early semi-permanent settlements and buildings across the world at the time being. Mizog Thogg was one of the first to be a sailor out into the New World, the second half of Elinciae's landmasses, and would be known as the New World Cook, as he did it as a means to find some new foods. He landed in Snuish Dresh, a marshy location, and would spend a lot of his time trying some of the New World foods and pieces. His son, Quaylog Thogg, makes me have to take a step back from the Thogg lineage, back to the Grand Exodus. See, when the Grand Exodus occurred, not everyone followed Garthog Thogg. In fact, some went in their own direction. And this some would be the some that would actually find the New World first. Quaylog Thogg is known as the Tribal Peacekeeper, as this side of the world never got further beyond the tribal stage, really, and became more of a nomadic landmass controlled by a few subsects of people in their own sort of ways. The tribal peacekeeper would explore the expanse beyond Suistresh and meet with a few tribes that were in the region, and furthermore provide peace. His son, Ragarth IV, would be known as the New World Philosopher, and would actually philosophize a lot on people and their means of doing different things and why they were the way they are. He specifically philosophized on the question of why a multitude of people didn't follow Garthog Thogg and how they had became only tribal in nature. However, this philosophy is something that is commonly overlooked more for his values at human philosophy and their general interactions with each other in the modern day. His son, Sherog Thogg, would be known as the Pressured, and he got scared of all of the things happening in the New World, and due to the supply pressure, due to this new influx of peoples in the New World, would actually retire early due to his stress, and spent most of his days staying in the tomb of Thogg. His son, Zigog Thogg, would be known as the Bridge Builder, and would build a lot of the bridges on some of the major rivers in the world. Specifically the Rudru River, which would actually help expand the available land in the New World to a majority of the people in it, and those exploring it at the time. Kalog Thogg, the cereal maker, was born with a chronic illness, and therefore would spend most of his days actually making cereal instead of exploring the world. Yargog Thogg would then furthermore move away from the lifeline that his grandfather and father before him had, and would be known as the Northern Pirate, mainly sailing and plundering a lot of the Ablela Islands and the people living on it. His son, Phlagog Thogg, would be known as the Phoenix Friend, as he went back to the New World and would find a phoenix in the Curlead mountain range, which in turn would be the phoenix that was believed to have been seen by Balrog Thogg. He would actually form a decently deep friendship with this phoenix, and this phoenix would also later be the same phoenix that Thoggar III would find during his search for a lot of different materials to help improve himself and his group to take down the Dark Moon chains. However, that is getting quite a far way ahead of ourselves. Torog Thogg, the son of Phlagog Thogg, would be known as the Lake Dipper. He would discover Hoysel, Escon, and Awaye lakes, and furthermore a lot of the countryside surrounding them. He basically discovered a major portion of the New World, nearly a third of its landmass. His son, Malrog Thogg, the Mountaineer, would then go on to map the entirety of the Cistern Mountains, which include some of the largest mountains in Elinciae, having climbed a majority of them himself. Next is Garog Thogg II, also known as the Winter Warlord. He died exploring the Achiacor tundra and savanna in an attempt to claim new land, taking out a multitude of natives on his way. Greg Thogg, the Winter Retriever, made it all the way to Hotraberg in an attempt to find his father's corpse and sent it back to the Tomb of Thogg. Derog Thogg, the Tropical Cook, went southern and started cooking around in Quohedon, a relatively tropical location with a nice bit of heat, very much different to what his family before him had to deal with. Derog Thogg II became a farmer and farmed a crap ton of rennery leaves. His son, Darug Thogg, also known as the Sandstorm, was a desert hermit that went and lived off in the Kalanir part of the Theonentian Desert. His son didn't like the heat, Darug Thogg II, and went over to Espa and became a cold cook in their tundras. Darug Thogg III was also known as the Mountain Cook, and went a little bit further into the Viatet mountain range and found a lot of edible goods and things to cook while he was there. And finally, in the grand expedition of finding everything in the world, Darug Thogg, also known as the Pedring Cook, found the last bit of land that others had, not fully yet explored, and did it in the name of cooking and finding all of the good food that he could want. His son, Talog Thogg II, was known as the Lecturer, and taught the world of many things and was a great teacher. However, he also bored a lot of people to death. Alright, now that we are relatively through the full exploration of the world of Emdot's part of the history, we now lead in to the build-up to the warring periods of Elinciae's history. And also, this is where we're going to start going into a rapid-fire segment, because a lot of these guys have a little bit of things to them, but then don't have too much other than what they did at that period. Alright, ready, set, go. Kalog Thogg II was known as the Keeper. He hoarded knowledge obsessively. Zigog Thogg II was known as the Melted. He dug too deep in the Dreas Mountains, caused an eruption, and the resulting landmass is where Shaf was stationed to be born as the capital in the country near the Dreas Mountains. Olga Thogg II was the Rock Claimer, climbed mountains and liked collecting a ton of rocks. Yargog Thogg II was known as the Lost. He died sailing, trying to head back to the Draken Isles, and got confused at sea. Farog Thogg was known as the Marsh Master. He lived in the Aenean marshes and practiced a bit of witchcraft. Hotog Thogg was known as the Charmer. He spent time in Cabrella wooing many. Farog Thogg II was known as the Island Hopper and hopped around the islands between the two land masses and established a fair amount of ports at many. Thagrog Thogg was known as the Southern Wanderer, and after his father had sailed off towards Colsouth, Thagrog Thogg ended up wandering it and ended up laying out a location for the Colsouth outpost. Bogart Thogg, the son of Thagrog Thogg, would then found the Colsouth base, and which would later become the alchemist capital of the world. Freg Fogg, also known as the Codfather, really loved fish. He eats them and he raises them. And his son, Velog Thogg, hated fish so much because of the amount of fish that his father had, he killed so many fish and even hunted a few species to extinction. Zorog Thogg, the Murdered Merchant, would take a different approach to what his predecessors had done and ended up traveling the world doing some mercantile industry. And while in Awaye, he was killed trying to sell some things to people where he wasn't exactly wanted. Alagog Thogg was known as the Wandering Cook. He wandered the world, cooked many things, and by the end of his lifetime had a huge cookbook of a multitude of different beasts, creatures, and the likes. Ragarth Thogg V was a philosopher of war, and he philosophized war and why people would and could fight, and why, there was a reason behind fighting in the first place. Borog Thogg, the arsonist, really loved fire, and burnt a large portion of some of the forested regions of the world. Oleg Thogg, the renewer and son of Borog Thogg, decided he didn't like seeing all the forests get burned down and went and fixed his dad's issues. His son, Lesog Thogg, was known as the Poisonous Cook, who poisoned and killed a lot of high-ranking enemies with his cooking and masterful spy work. Zelrog Thogg, the Great Divider, started a grand war in the Achiacor Tundra, practically shaping some of the major wars that would shape a lot of the world near the time. His son, Bungathar Thogg, was known as the Witch Doctor, and gave a lot of remedies and cures around the Ethian Great Lake. Ungathar Thogg was known as the Thoughtless. She was a girl. She kind of just existed, did a little bit of things here and there. Didn't really have many ideas about it. Just was there. Larthar Thogg, the tailor and son of Ungathar, sewed and produced many leather garments, which are now all kept in museums due to their legendary value. His son, Larthar Thogg, the fat cook, cooked a lot of fatty meals and had quite the weight to him. Slothar Thogg, also known as the Sloth, only ever saw Antaros, and slept a lot and didn't do much with his time. Borngathar Thogg, the grill master, grilled some of the greatest meals in all of Elinciae in Arkar. Squagog Thogg, the dancer, dances as part of many plays and courts, and as a way to boost morale to some royalty during the times of grand wars. Mizog Thogg II was known as the counselor and provided safety and comfort to those in need who had dealt with a lot of problems. And his son, Kragar Thogg, was known as the butcher, who went in basically in these great war times, killed an entire army by himself, and was a terrifyingly horrible person. His son, Fregor Thogg, decided that, butchering animals and farming them was much nicer than butchering people. And yeah. Wagathog, the dog whisperer, would develop from his forefathers and ended up training many dogs of many different types around the world and was generally an accredited person for those feats. Babathog, the spirit speaker, spoke to the dead and was commonly found walking around the graveyards of the world. She was unique in the way that she worked, as she basically found her own interest in things and didn't have any real influence from her family before her. Korgar Thogg, her son, however, definitely took after her and was known as the Mysterious Merchant. He would pick up a lot of random artifacts and trinkets, which somehow almost always had some sort of magic involved with them. His son, Garkar Thogg, was known as the Great Ocean Fisher. He caught many a great giant fish, and also caught a few water wyveras himself during his time. His son, Tragar Thogg, became the tomato farmer, and he farmed tomatoes in Hoysel. Ukrog Thogg, the potion master, brewed some of the earliest potions in Pananium, which mostly were kind of the poisonous type, not really anything that was helpful, mainly just helped with wars going on. Downog Thogg was the deep delver and mined in some of the greatest depths of the world, and furthermore would find a lot of rare materials in his time. Dowlog Thogg, the animal protector, made a lot of animal armor for warrior animals at the time frame. Grugar Thogg, the banjo player, played banjo across the trails in the Mashari Desert, inspiring different travelers and also basically functioning as a traveling bard. Gurgar Thogg, the mighty, led a gigantic army, and Kugog Thogg, the crazed, went crazy fighting wars and ended up dying in a crazed heat of battle. His daughter, Norgar Thogg, was known as the wheat farmer, and she chose a very peaceful life of just farming wheat her entire time. Her son, Brakgor Thogg, was known as the baker, and he baked a lot of goods from the farm that his mother had created. And Bakehaw Thogg decided to one-up his father as the exotic baker and would make a lot of exotic goods with rare materials across the world. Jar Jar Thogg, the forge keeper, would then take a lot of unique influences from across the world travels that he did and would be known as the Forge Keeper, basically being a blacksmith to many around the world. Kragar Thogg, his son, was known as the Undertaker and would go and take care of the dead and bury them. Ugar Thogg, the Realm Keeper, was a very powerful wizard who overlooked a lot of the world at the time and was known for being a very good strategist. His son, Gartholomew Thogg, was known as the Scholar and further developed on a lot of historical arcana that was discussed prior to develop some more modern forms of judgment magic. His son, Snagog Thogg, was so arcanically inclined that when he fell asleep, he would randomly sleep cast the spell Flare a lot and cause a lot of fires because of it, and thus he was known as the Sleepy Mage. His son, Alligar Thogg, was known as the Actarchus Hunter and would hunt a lot of greater creatures in Actarchus and also just general deer, elk, and whatever brought his fancy. Bathor Thogg, the bartender, would bartend in Entourage to a multitude of different people and was known for his legendary drinks. Yarbadar Thogg, the Rambler, takes after me as a person rambling in the middle of a video about a crap ton of different people when there's 200 more Thoggs to talk about. Yippee. His son, Flargar Thogg, was known as the Gambler and gambled a lot of his life savings away and furthermore made the Thogg lineage kind of poor. Marbar Thogg was known as the Candy Maker and spent most of his life actually making a candy franchise, which is still upkept today in the Marbar industry of Elinciae. Swarthar Thogg, the Righteous, led a righteous war as a paladin and fought for many good deeds. Mitterthog Thogg, the instrument maker, made a ton of golden instruments and used them to sing the praises of the righteous war his father had led. Paragar Thogg, the essayist, is also like me, writing a lot of essays for MDOD and the likes. Sorry, I meant he wrote a lot of essays for the world of Elinciae. Marigar Thogg, the rattling bard, would rattle off a lot of different notes and made in this world what is and made equivocally jazz for Elinciae. Dudagoth Thogg, known as the Soldier, fought as a simple soldier in a war due to the relatively slowly decreasing amount of funds that the Thogg lineage had at the time frame. And his son decided to change that thought and went and learned how to become a doctor. Gripthar Thogg would then slowly rebuild a lot of the Thogg lineage's money. And his son, Borthor Thogg, would become known as the Married, and spent most of his life with his loving wife. Berthor Thogg, the Planter, was a girl who spent most of her time planting the garden around the Thoggarian estate. This estate would slowly get lost to time, especially after some of the next few Thogg. Candor Thogg was the Short, and was known for being basically a dwarf. Camelog Thogg, the son from Candor Thogg, was known as a legendary king who would abandon the Thogg estate to go reclaim Entourage as king of it. Lorf Thogg became known as the Forgotten, and after Camelog Thogg had died, he got kicked out of the castle so that the Thogg lineage would go back to doing basically whatever they wanted. And he led a relatively simple life after that. Barthogomule Thogg, the Savant, was accredited in a multitude of different things, such as early Vase alchemy and early magic, and also was a relatively good swordsman for himself as well. Gartholomew II was known as the Bookman, and basically collected a lot of books across the world and started his own library. Rockgar Thogg was known as the Musician, and boy did he know how to play a guitar. Regar Thogg, the Record Keeper, would basically record and upkeep a lot of the history of Elinciae. He even was able to collect a lot of history about the Thogg lineage as well, which actually helps in terms of making lore videos such as this. And now I'm talking like they're real people. Yippee! Don't you guys understand that I've got a little bit crazy making this video? Oh boy! Gongthar Thogg, the Gong, played gongs his entire life. Ragathar Thogg the Sixth was known as the Philosopher of Philosophy, and when questioned a lot of the philosophy that his forefather philosophers had made in their lifetime. Kalog Thogg the Second was known as the Thick-Headed, and unlike his father, was relatively dumb. His daughter, Angara Thogg, would be the one who would actually fight and trap Solgar, the Grand Demon of Wrath, in the Crystal Arch in Entourage, keeping it safe, and overall just keeping the people around it safe as well, protecting the many from the grand wrath that Solgar had, and the great sacrifices and demonic beings that Solgar brought with him. Edgar Thogg was known as the poet and wrote a lot of poetry about his mother's great deeds, and also wrote a lot of darker poetry involving demons in general. His son, Krogar Thogg, was known as the metallurgist, and made a grand metal statue in the town where Angara Thogg had trapped Solgar. Garthra Thogg, the woodcarver, moved out into the woods and spent most of her time carving wooden figurines, of which only a few would ever get sold in her lifetime. However, she had a very happy life. Garthbog Thogg was known as the taxidermist, who would then, in turn, collect a lot of creatures living on Garthra Thogg's estate, and slowly make a ton of them into different taxidermies, which were all very lifelike in appearance and very beautiful. Garthala Thogg was known as the lyricist, and she wrote her own musical numbers and songs for the many of the world. And while she never sang many of them herself, those who have sang them have realized that they are some of the most beautiful songs in all of Elinciae, even to this day. Garthra Thogg II took after her namesake, however decided to go a little bit special with it, and wood-carved wooden jewelry. Garthsag Thogg would be known as the wind chime maker, and would make a lot of wooden wind chimes in this humble cottage that had now started to become this, well, beautiful place for the Thogg lineage. Jailg Thogg, the jailer, would go out into the world from the estate and work as a jailer in the nearby town. Garog Balg Thogg would be known as the furniture crafter and continued the wood carving lineage that his forefathers and mothers had brought into this family and made a lot of wooden furniture. His son, Garlog Thogg, continued that and became known as the bedmaker, who made a lot of beds. Garthjarg Thogg, the marathoner, would become known for his great athletic abilities, running effectively some of the first marathons in Elinciae, and would also be one of the first Olympian-style athletes Elinciae had seen. Garthjarg Thogg II would then become known as the legendary fisher, after his father had done a lot of marathons around the world and seen a lot of amazing natural places. There are still fish records that Garthjarg Thogg holds that have not been beaten today, mostly because some of those fish are so unbelievably rare that they have yet to be caught at the size of which Garthjarg Thogg had caught. Garlog Thogg II was known as the woodsman and spent a lot of his time clearing the woods and processing wood. And Garthra Thogg III had moved away at this time from her namesake's cabin to become an accountant in some of the nearby towns. Garthgog Thogg did not like the boring life that his mother had had and became an entertainer. Goat Thogg, the horse tamer, would see a lot of the horses around his father's grand shows and would end up learning how to ride horses for himself and even claimed a few wild ones. Morgar Thogg, the mortician, would take care of labeling and upkeeping all of the bodies in the Tomb of Thogg during his lifetime. Morgar Thogg, the cremator, basically took on what had been stated by Morgar Thogg and would then cremate some of the ashes of those who had wished that to be their way of dying. Thagagar Thogg, the potter, would move away from the deathly business that his father and grandfather had started and would instead look into pottery for his interest. Rogar Thogg, the thief, would take up a life of evil, stealing from those who really probably shouldn't have been stolen from. Garmor Thogg, the fish breeder, would breed a ton of fish, and actually is a part of the reason why some of the Water Wyvera have such high numbers in the world. Garmor Thogg, the weapons dealer, would then deal out a lot of weapons to some of the warring factions at the time frame, making some of the grandest weapon designs that are even still modified into use today. Morgara Thogg, the Dark Heart, was an occult-style witch who herself would end up discovering a lot of dark arts and would be the first to cast a black hole spell against her opponents. The tome has now been accurately made, and as such is no longer a hard spell to find your way to if you are a very good dark mage. However, Morgara Thogg was the one who discovered it. Vox the Thogg, the mountain painter, spent a lot of her time traveling the world and painting mountains. Donar Thogg, the philanthropist, spent a lot of his time traveling the world, and furthermore, with the riches that the Thogg family had now regained from some of his family members prior, mostly Garamor Thogg, would donate a lot to those in need, basically making up for the mistakes that Rogar Thogg had caused. Ogfar Thogg, the world traveler, would then furthermore be the only person, would then furthermore travel the world, and is one of the few people in Elinciae who could have ever claimed in history that they have been to every town in Elinciae at the time of that statement. Ogtal Thogg, the portalist, would then use a lot of the travels and the travel records that Ogfar Thogg would make to essentially create some of the early forms of teleportation-based transportation in Elinciae, of which is very expensive at the range of which he was covering. He was able to develop and work on it, however, it is definitely a costly expense that is not used very commonly. Ogthog the plumber would go entirely separate ways from what his fathers had done before him, and decided to spend a life working on plumbing around the Arkar region. Ogfal Thogg, the psychiatrist, spent most of his time doing more doctor work and earning more money for the Thogg line. Argthog, the healer, would then follow suit from his father and learn healing himself, becoming almost a priest under Solvari's magic. Gaxnathog, the florist, would take to gardening again at the cottage that the Thogg lineage had fully claimed at this point, and would sell these flowers for a long period of time. Gogaku Thogg, the brawler, spent most of his life picking fights against much stronger opponents and somehow always coming out on top. Garala Thogg, the jeweler, would take after Garthra Thogg II, however didn't really care much for the wooden parts of the craft that Garthra II had, and instead just became a typical jeweler of metalwork goods. Ogles Thogg became known as the town's watch, and moved into a nearby town as a guardian after he had had his kid. Dorfcan Thogg, known as the Smaller, because he was even more of a dwarf than Candorf Thogg. Gosh. Dorf Will Thogg became known as the Determined, and despite being a relatively small leader, was a leader who led massive great armies for some of the wars at the time, and is one of the most accredited generals in the history of Elinciae. Ogyar Thogg, the yam farmer, would spend a lot of his days farming yams, and his son Barmar Thogg would become known as the beekeeper, and started a large bee farm near the Thogg cottage. Thorbay Thogg, the window crafter, would craft windows in his own little workshop that he added to the cottage to basically help create a lot of the world's necessary windows, and was also known for some of his stained glass that are common in churches near Antras to Arkar. Grogek Thogg, the grotesque, was a very insane fellow who spent a lot of his time on the battlefield maiming and harming and torturing his opponents. Ragatha Thogg II, and the daughter to Grogek Thogg, was known as the Dollmaker, and went away from her father's a bit insane antics and made dolls for a living. Garlog Thogg II became known as the Filer, moving away from the cottage of the Thogg lineage to fully live in an area where he could work effectively as a secondary accountant that would file multitudes of goods for a company in the region. Ogkor Thogg, known as the Teacher, would spend a lot of his time teaching children and telling them of all the great stories of the world, and furthermore, teaching them how to be good adults in the real world of Elinciae. Rogbala Thogg was known as the basketball player, and basically, do I need to say more? Frog Thogg, his son, was known as the Amphibian, and spent most of his life actually in swamps with frogs, and slowly actually developed a way to breathe underwater as an early underwater breathing potion, and was able to make underwater habitats for a few people. His son, Gogar Thogg II, was known as the Fencer, and spent a lot of his time in Olympian-style fencing matches as a great sportsman himself. His son, Rog Thogg, became known as the Fence Maker, and made fences, because the Fencer decided to have a kid that just made fences instead of continuing the fencing lineage. You know, because that's how that works. Rogmal Thogg would then entirely deviate even further, and be a coal miner for his entire life. Rogal Thogg, also known as the Seamster, would continue some of the early seamstress duties that Ragatha I had, and upkept and made a lot of dresses and good outfits and attires for many who wanted royal clothing for their royal statuses. Rogath Thogg, known as the Policeman, would spend a lot of time in Arkar working as one of their types of guards that would basically live in the village and just take care of any lawbreakers. His son, Og Thogg, would be known as the Judge, and would judge actually a lot of the people that were brought in Arkar, some even brought in by Rogath Thogg himself. Ogsa Thogg was known as the Bread Baker, and she spent a lot of time slowly moving out into the wilds and growing her own wheat, which would be made into bread. Gogsi Thogg would then be known as the Lighthouse Builder, and would further move towards oceans and lakes to build lighthouses on rocks. And her son, Quaggoth Thogg, would actually spend most of his time in the lighthouses built by Gogsi as the lighthouse man that took care of all of the things that the lighthouse needed. Maltho Thogg is known as the Storyteller, and took a lot of the historical stories of Elinciae and found ways to tell grand stories through them, even writing a few for himself that were entirely based on the mythos of the world. Grogthag Thogg would be known as the Piper, and would spend actually a lot of time performing different songs of the musical variety with flutes and bagpipes that were inspired by his father's writing. Logva Thogg, known as the Glass Blower, would make a lot of glass sculptures and vases, and overall was a very great artist of the Thogg lineage. Ugar Thogg, known as the Tanner, would tan a lot of leatherwork goods. Ugar Thogg II was a stonecutter who cut a lot of stones for different architectural purposes during the time frame. Ogmus Thogg was known as the Enchantress, and is one of the great mages that Elinciae has seen, and is one of the great users of arcane enchanting, having made grand studies into the process during her time. Alog Thogg was known as the Stonemason, and built lots of towers and buildings from these stones that Ugar Thogg II had made. Ragarth VII became known as the Animal Philosopher, and basically philosophized on evolution and how the dragons made the animals and how that happened. Ogshar Thogg was known as the Cowboy, and spent most of his time perusing the plains of the Mashari Desert, and would farm cows down there. Yargog Thogg III would become known as the medic, and would spend most of his time taking care of any in need nearby the Mashari Desert, where the Thogg lineage had slowly drifted off to yet again. Phlegog Thogg II was known as the stew cook, and would cook a ton of stews of a lot of different creatures during his time. Torog Thogg II would be known as the Coal South Mapper, and would actually map out a layout of Coal South after he got to the founded Coal South base. Maorog Thogg II was known as the orthodontist, and he did dentistry. Garog Thogg II was known as the translator, and translated a lot of runes into common for a lot of different royal beings who didn't fully understand how runes worked. Reg Thogg would take after Phlegog Thogg as the soup cook, and journeyed over into Espa to cook a lot of soups for the many people who lived in that region. Darog Thogg, furthermore, decided he wanted to have fun during his lifetime, and spent most of his time taking care of people's hair, which he enjoyed a lot. Darog Thogg IV would continue the art style that his father had, and became a tattoo artist. Dorog Thogg II would be known as the urologist. I don't need to go into detail on this one. Darug Thogg V would build barns, and Darug Thogg VI would then be a housekeeper of the new Thoggarian estate that had been built over in Espa. Darug Thogg VII would be known as the locksmith, and smithed a lot of locks and keys for many across the world. Kron Thogg, known as the businessman, traveled further away from the Thogg estate once again, and spent most of his time doing business deals across the world, earning the Thogg lineage more money. Tal Thogg, his son, would be known as the lamp lighter, lighting a crap ton of lamps for towns and cities wherever he went, and upkeeping them as well. Cal Thogg, known as the vain drunkard, would then take all the money that his grandfather had worked towards and spend it all on drinking. Yippee. Zig Thogg, however, was able to turn that around from what his father had done, and became known as the aristocrat, earning a place in Entourage royalty yet again, however this time not as king, but as an advisor. Olga Thogg III would move away from this location, however, and became known as the magician, being a street performer rather than a politician. Gog Thogg would then stay further closer to the public masses, and became known as the carriage master, as such causing him to travel a large span of the world, getting himself all the way down to Bablington, where his son Pharaoh Thogg would become king of Bablington, claiming a new country for the Thogg lineage. However, problems with this would occur with the fact that the Tomb of Thogg was in Entourage. His son, Hoto Thogg, would move away from from his father's royal acclamations, and would take care of stables in Bablington so as to not get himself hurt for what his father had done. His son, Pharaoh II, would move to Wolfleburg and then become king of that place. This also furthermore caused even more problems, because the Tomb of Thogg is not in Wolfleburg either. It's still in Entourage. Agrog Thogg was then further left to deal with his father's problems, and made boats to save his life from any upcoming problems that would have been caused by the royalty of Pharaoh being not in the correct location in the world. Bokt Thogg was known as the cart maker, and made carts for the many different servants of the king of Wolfleburg. Reg Thogg would then become known as the Warden, as he traveled off into the world and actually became a full-fledged warden under a demon with earthly acclamation. This demon had no problems that were caused onto the Thogg lineage, however, it is uncertain what demon it was. but it seems to have been beneficial in some way or another. Thog was known as the caretaker, and from his father's location in the world, started an orphanage, which was actually very well acclaimed and very well liked for the many in the world. His son, Thog, would travel the world looking for the strongest swordsman, and would slowly, over time, become the greatest swordsman Elinciae has ever seen. His son, Thog, was known as the Resurrectionist, and was very good at casting the resurrection spell, and as such was constantly traded between different churches in the world under the guise of Solvari. Thog the Eighth would take the knowledge that was possessed by Thog and become the sole philosopher, and during this time frame wrote a lot of important parts of Cavalieric energy design super far in advance to the modern era, which is actually furthermore accredited by Thog III in his designs later on in the modern era as to how he created Cavalieric energy and the studying required for how to properly run Cavalieric energy. Thog was then not very unique or interesting at all, and just became a milkman. Thog continued the farming lifestyle that Thog had now started and became a wool trader. Thog, the brass worker, worked in a small town with a brass industry that came from it and became known for his great work in the brass industry. Thog, the hat maker, would make a lot of hats from this location, and Thog as well would become known as a wig consultant who helped create wigs for any people's needs, and furthermore brought a lot of people to the small town that his father and grandfather had lived in. His son, Thog, heard a lot of the cultists that had caused the inevitable flare illness that Sembrion would inevitably inflict on the occultists that hated Sembrion in the world, and was one of the few naysayers to their kind who spoke against them and actively protected the dragons, noting that his lineage was one that basically sparked a lot of what the dragons had brought into this world. He, of course, never was able to persuade these occultists away from their evil wants of killing Sembrion. However, it is still important that he spoke against them. Thog then went south to the land of Coal South, where he spent most of his time prepping ice blocks to be sailed off to the more centralized continents of the world as the ice dealer. And Thog, his son, would then get trapped in some occult dealings and with a few demons and be known as the occultist. There are a few sons that were killed due to these trades. However, the son that lived, Thog, would go back to a simple life as a chimney sweeper. And his son, Thog, would become the carpenter, which would further upgrade the village that they had lived in for this time being. Thog was relatively crazy and ran off into the wilderness and became known as the moss enthusiast due to his love of all the different mosses of the world. His moss collection is one that has never been replicated ever again. Thog, the midwife, was the daughter of our moss enthusiast, who in turn would help take care of a lot of children early in life, and furthermore became very interested in the ways of doctoral and medicinal needs. Thog, the wood pattern maker, would move away from a lot of the chaos of his grandfather and the more calming nature of his mother, and instead return to the woods to make wooden patterns from trees he had milled himself. Thog decided that Thog was boring, and went into Arkar and became a tax collector for the Arkar government. Thog was known as the Rune Scribe and helped develop a lot of the major arcanic wonders in a lot of different towns and cities that helped place multiple of them on the map. Abathog, the son of Wagthog, was known as the Mercenary, and she spent her entire life hunting and killing bandits. Korgar II was known as the Rat Catcher, and, like his mother, just for rats, spent most of his life killing pests. His son, Kargarthog, is known as the Leech Collector, who collected a ton of different leeches of all different types and sizes, and was even able to catch a Wyvera of Earth, which was shaped like a leech, known as the Pagode. And this Pagode is a very dangerous earthen Wyvera that multitudes of people are afraid of, and he casually was able to catch one and keep it in captivity until it had died. Gartrathog, the Plague Barrier, spent most of her time dealing with a large set of illnesses in the world and burying the dead due to her seemingly natural resistances to some of the plagues in the world. Gradgarthog, the son of Gartrathog, was the Executioner, and with his holy blade laid down a multitude of demon dealers across his lifetime. Grogukthog, the Wool Spinner, lived a very simple life spinning wool. Ogarthog would then be known as the Mudlark, and spent most of his time cleaning up the rivers of Elinciae, doing the best he could to collect a lot of different unique goods and wares, and even found one of the legendary weapons that our archsmith Bolgarogthog would make almost 7,000 years prior. Owlogthog would be known as the Owl Master, and would train a ton of owls in the world. Rugarthog would then become known as the Rhubarb Baker, and was particularly known for his rhubarb pie. Ugogthog, the journalist, would write a ton of unique journals and news reports for the world at the time, and was a generally well-storied, bard-like character for the world around. Orgarthog, the potato farmer, lived a very sedentary and simple life, farming potatoes. And his son, Rakgorthog, would become known as the Ragged Bone Man, due to the fact that the man ate almost nothing for his entire life, and was practically skin and bones. His son, Akothog, would work a simple job as the sweeper, sweeping up a multitude of different castles and manors for those in need as a janitor. Jarthog would then retake up the arms of the mortician before him and became known as the coroner, and furthermore identified a lot of things in the Tomb of Thogg and a few of the cemeteries surrounding it in Antaros. Kegarthog would be known as the bookkeeper and bookkept for a great company in Elinciae. Yarthog would then be known as the barber, and he started up his own barbershop where he made some very crazy and unique hairstyles, some of which are still used by the Thogg lineage today. Ramul Thogg, the cabinet maker, would continue the more sedentary lifestyle that his fathers had brought, and would spend a lot of time making cabinets for royalty. Nagagthog, the basket weaver, spent most of her life weaving baskets, some of which are still sought after today as some of the most expensive baskets that ever existed. Lagarthog would be known as the bricklayer, and would use his bricklaying capabilities to create some very masterfully designed brick buildings in the world of Elinciae. Aethorthog would then be known as the lamp maker, and he made a ton of lamps, which used judgment magic setups in Elinciae with some good usage of power supplies and arcane coal to burn for long periods of time. Badarthog would then take up the lute and become known as the lute musician, traveling the world as a bard playing the lute. Herogthog would be known as the falconer, and was able to accurately teach a falcon a multitude of different tricks, how to fight enemies, and also be a well accredited person for his lifetime. Argarthog, the periodic scientist, would go and identify almost all of the periodic table elements that exist in Elinciae. And now, as we approach the more modern history, we come to the grandfathers of the Thoggar Thoggs, of which, while not being too important, do have a lot of actual decent history to them, making them very different from some of the ones prior. Rambar Thogg was one of the final who stayed sedentary, and was known as the Plowman. He plowed fields and raised a lot of money for the farm that the Thoggs had, that his son Warthar Thogg would be known as the miller for, making a lot of wheat and flour and baking for the Thogg lineage. Midor Thogg would become known as the Golden. He had a curse which slowly moved him away from the family lineage, and furthermore, eventually was able to get a lot of gold for the Thogg family due to the fact that this curse would cause a lot of things around him to slowly turn to gold. Parathog, known as the Quick-Witted, outlived the curse that his father had, and was able to use the money that his father had created to then assert some power in his family. Marathog would become known as the Starless Astronomer, as it is at this time that the world's calendar year switches from BCE to CE, when she helps be a part of the team that discovers Solvari is truly the sun and that they are alone in the universe surrounding them. She also discussed what a lot of the void in the sky was during her studying, and would pick up a lot of what Ragathar II had made and accredited. Dudathog would be known as the Red Hero. She was a part of the Way of Red for a large period of time, even leading it shortly before passing it on to the lineage that now holds it currently. Gribthog would then become a commander under the lead of the Way of Red, which would help fight some of the great war that was going on in Pananium at the time. Orvthog would be known as the Bone Carver. He was a little crazy in his ways, however he did carve some very artisanal goods from the bones he gathered. Barthog Thog would be known as the Environmentalist, and his life's work was spent on upkeeping and taking care of some of the rarer plants in the world. His son, Rock Thog, yes, his name is quite literally Rock Thog, would be a tool maker of the stone variety. Regthog, the senior caretaker, took care of the old fellows surrounding the home of the Thogg lineage at the time, before eventually moving in towards Arkar and staying there most of his lifetime. Guardthog would become known as the Guardian, and would become a town's guard for the Arkar capital. Gongthog would be known as the Taste Tester, having now ascended to royal lineage, and working under the cook's guise to protect from poison. He would inevitably die to poison, however this was not before having his daughter, Ragathog, which would be known as the Cuddly. And she made a lot of blankets and stuffed animals in her lifetime. Her daughter, Lokathog, would be known as the Beer Connoisseur, and would spend most of her life drunk, tasting a lot of different beers of the world. Erogthog became known as the Dog Walker, and walked the royal family's dogs in Arkar. Rarth-Thog, the guardsman, once again ascended to a guardian duty for them, and Bogart-Thog became known as the Firefighter, due to the fact he sacrificed himself at the end of his life fighting a fire in the Arkar political house. Alog-Thog, the Fearmongerer, caused a lot of pain and strife for the many people, causing him to get outcast due to the fear-mongering he was causing. And Rathog, the son of Alagthog, became a cannibal known as the Flesh Eater, thoroughly cementing their name and the future of the family as a crazy type. And the Thogg lineage became somewhat feared until his son, Sagart Thog, took up the stage as the Colosseum fighter in the Greylore Colosseum, and earned the respect that the Thogg lineage deserved. His son, Arthrog Thogg, became known as the Militiamen, and would fight as a militia for Antaros before his son, Thoggar I, was born. There are 3 more very important characters in the lineage, and a 4th, which actually, furthermore, is very important to the 3rd. Thoggar I is known as the Barbarian, and he spent his life fighting against the Antaros rebellion for the king, who was sick and supposed to be sacrificed to resurrect Solgar, the Grand Demon of Wrath. Thoggar I stood beside Liam, the man who would kill and freeze Solgar into the moon, and all in all was one of the leaders of the mercenary group that was hired to help the Way of Blue stop this problem before it occurred. He goes down in history as being one of the few men to join the Way of Blue that was not initially wielding one of the Way of Blue's normal weapons, and would furthermore be a very threatening opponent for any who stood against him. His son, Thoggar II, is known as the Demon Scientist, and he spent his life studying the moon and Solgar's corpse in the moon to figure out how it was creating demons on the moon. Yes, the moon had demons, after Liam had froze Solgar, and Conream and all the other dragons made the moon into a thing above Elinciae. He also developed a plan for what would be known as daemonic energy, in which it would use chains to bind the moon to the surface of the earth to collect the energy from demons and summon them nearby these chain bases. And these chain bases would then work as farms for which you would harvest the daemonic energy by killing demons. And their soul energy would then be used as a fuel source to provide energy to the world nearby. Of course, when dealing with demons, there's always something bad to come from it. And Thoggar III, which is known as the Alchemist, would be the one to kill his father after a demon deal from Alabaster himself. Alabaster would promise Thoggar III and his twin, Garthog II, a lot of high power alongside the chain-based guardians if they were able to resurrect him. And Thoggar III would develop and look into the mathematics behind it to realize that these chain bases were set up in the perfect ritual locations to collapse the moon when the time came and enough souls had been provided to use Solgar's dead body as a remnant vessel for Alabaster in the Moon Seed. The Moon Seed would be taken by Thoggar from the Tomb of Thogg and then stolen by Garthog II, who would betray his twin Thoggar III for the ultimate power that Alabaster had promised the two of them. He would send Thoggar III off to the prison on Sarenvir, where eventually he would upbuild a revolution versus the chain bases after he had woke with 0 memories to his name other than his own name, and would slowly build up to the Dark Moon War, in which Thoggar III would eventually kill Garthog II and follow up by eventually killing Alabaster with the team that he had made through the entirety of the Dark Moon War. Thoggar III then goes on to be a very accredited alchemist, developing Cavalieric energy as stated prior, and also being one of the only humans in all of history to have ever spoken to the Creator. With that, thank you all so much for watching and listening to me ramble for almost an hour and a half, it seems. If you enjoy this and would like to see more, Down in the description is not only going to be a playlist for this series, but a playlist for the music once it's out, and a playlist for the campaign I'm running on the channel, Depths of the Blighted Heart. If you'd like to help out, or just contribute to the ideas of Endon, fan art is always welcome and appreciated in the Discord server, also seen below. Leave a comment for any lore you'd like to see covered in the future, or if you're confused about something. If you're confused about something in this video, I understand, trust me. I always will try to respond to all the comments on every video. So, if you want to know more, just ask me there, or once again, in the Discord. Have a good one. Bye-bye!